This video is on chapter 1 and I will just highlight a few important concepts. The rest you will have to read yourself. So before continue watching, just make sure that you have actually read the chapter. So if you have read the chapter, you will see in the definition, which is important, that there are three key words in the definition of public economics. So we will study expenditure of the government, we will study taxation, and then we will also study financing, which means that if the government spends more than it collects through taxes, it has to finance the difference. We say they have to finance the deficit, and there are different ways of doing that. So you should have a look at figure 1.1 and distinguish between the definitions of central government, which is just the national government with all the government departments such as the National Treasury, which is the one that we will focus on the most. We will also have a look at the Department of Social Development, because transfers, as you'll see today, is a big component of government expenditure. Then the general government means it's the central government plus all the provincial governments plus all the hundreds of local municipal governments. And then the public sector is the collection of all government institutions, including the public enterprises such as Econ and Transnet, and the total is the public sector. So you have to know the three definitions of and three levels of government. Table 1.1 is very important, and I've underlined in red that all the numbers mean it's the percent of GDP. So all the numbers are not in millions of rands or so, but it means the percent of GDP in a particular decade. Now I've numbered the four blue rows because I will show you graphs of those just now so that you can see a picture. If you just stare at the numbers in this table, they wouldn't necessarily make a lot of sense. But if you zoom into them, then it can start to make sense. So you should look for trends in the table. And this table is about the public sector, so it's about all three spheres of government. The first row is taxes, direct and indirect, and you can see that the percent of GDP has increased from below 15% to close to 30%, so it has doubled in 50 or so years' time as a percentage of GDP. The second is resource use, which is the sum of government consumption and investment, and if you add transfers to that, then you will get total public resource mobilization. So there are two definitions in the book which they will require you to know, namely the difference between resource use and resource mobilization in row 4. Now, resource use is the sum of government consumption and government investment. And the investment is both by the general government and public corporations. Then what are transfer payments? Transfer payments are the sum of interest on public debt. So that's almost like money down the drain, because if the government borrows money, they have to pay interest on it, and all of that interest could have been spent on productive use rather than just giving it back to the lenders of the money. Plus, transfer payments also subsidies, grants and other transfer payments to households and so on, and we will see that that has also increased significantly over time. So now I'm going to show you a picture of row 1 versus row 4, taxes, how much do we collect and how much do we spend. So 4 is the fourth row and 1 is taxes over time increasing, and you can see there's a difference between the two, so that's what I call the government deficit, because they spend more than what they collect. In the second graph, I'm going to repeat those two graphs, but I will add the numbers from the second row. That was resource use, namely government expenditure plus investment. Now you can see that the orange and blue lines in the second half of the graph are very close to each other. So that's a good sign. So there's enough money in the tax collection box to do all the government expenditure and investment. But the difference between yellow and blue comes from transfer payments. So that's the second component of resource mobilization, is transfer payments. Now you can think of child grants and old age grants, disability grants and so on, and just look at the slope of those lines. It has increased steeply over time, the transfer payments, and that's basically the difference between yellow and blue mostly in the table. So what you should see in the table is the different components of expenditure and revenue collection, and how it has increased over time. There are two columns of investment by the general government and by public corporations. And this is a sad story because investment as a proportion of GDP has decreased, and it's always been too low for many, at least for during your lifetime. Investment by the government has been too low. And I mean, they spend the money on households, they give the money to households, and they don't keep the infrastructure up, and they don't build enough infrastructure for future generations. That's the story of the expenditure of the government. Now, figure 1.2 is also important, and it shows the role of the relationship of government with other role players in the economy. Now, the picture is drawn such that you can see the relationship with firms and households, and with the factor market and goods, but it doesn't mean the government is the central piece in the economy. They are just one of the role players in the economy. So with firms and households, they provide public services and goods. So they provide electricity and water and roads and so on to all of us, firms and households, and in exchange for that we have to pay taxes. The government is also very active in the factor market. They hire labor just as firms hire labor, and they pay salaries and so on. And they also borrow money in the form of capital, and they spend a lot of money. So they have to pay salaries which they spend on the laborers. Then they're also involved in the goods market. Obviously, the government buys lots and lots of goods and services from the market. Just think of COVID-19, how much medicine that they have to buy from the pharmaceutical companies, and which they give free to households that don't have medical aid. So the government is very active in that market as well. Then there's another important figure, figure 1.3, which shows money flow. So if you think of the financial sector, all the banks together, where do they get their money from? Well, they get money from savings from everyone, from all their role players in the economy. First, the government could save if they spend less than what they collect, but they have negative savings at the moment. Fortunately, households save and firms save money and put it in the bank, and if we export more than we import, then we also get money from abroad, from the foreign sector. So there are different sources of funds which are then used by the government to spend, and they can invest. Firms invest, but the government can also invest. But they can only invest if they have money, if there are savings in the economy. So the problem with our investment graph that you've seen is exactly that: the government spends their money on other things like transfers and goods and services, and they don't invest enough. So this is an important figure as well. So regarding chapter 1, you obviously have to read the chapter. Read the chapter quickly, and then you also read the summary more intensely. Watch the 2021 videos and lecture slides. They are on, actually I think they're mostly in the form of narrated PowerPoint slides. So it's like watching a video if you play the slideshow. All of them are on ClickUp under 2021 lecture slides. Then look at the key concepts in the back of the textbook. There's a long list of key concepts which you need to know what they mean, and this textbook tells you exactly on which page these concepts occur. Then read the summary of the chapter. The authors really did a good job of summarizing everything. So if you don't have time to read the whole chapter, you at least have to read the summary a few times. And then they give you self-test questions, which you should look at and work out for yourself. Some of them you'll get for homework, and these are the questions that you can expect on tests and exams.